If you look at Thetford, for instance, in the 1960s, it was one of the fastest growing small towns in the country. And then there was deindustrialization. Companies began to leave. Thermos left in about 2003. Now it's one of the most deprived places in the country. In fact, many of its estates are some of the most deprived in the whole country. And people want to understand that. They want to make sense of it. They want to do something about it. And then there are motivated political actors who come in and say it's all the fault of the asylum seekers, it's all the fault of these people. And so you've got to put together a background of people having real lived experience of problems and political activists.
More asylum seekers have been moved from their homes after a third night of disorder in Thetford. There have been widespread disturbances in the Norfolk town since Tuesday. Around 100 people have tried to force their way into properties. The Norfolk Police Chief Constable says the behaviour of some protesters was criminal.
I understand that many people in Thetford are concerned about things going on in their communities at the moment, and they are out there protesting lawfully. The majority of people were doing that, so I wouldn't want to tar everyone with the same brush here. However, there was a significant minority who went way, way too far and brought crime onto the streets. And when that happens, of course we're going to respond, and we're going to respond robustly.
Respond robustly. Well, Henry Durand is the local democracy reporter for the Eastern Daily Press. You've been watching so much of this unfolding, Henry, and it's been going on for several days now. Any sign of it quietening down?
It's interesting. Last night appeared to be slightly less violent as the previous two nights, where on the second night, the public got in a massive scuffle with officers. Officers were sent to hospital. Last night was slightly more toned down, but at the same time, ultimately, it still ended up in asylum seekers being moved away from a property and evacuated by the police. They've just put a press release out now saying that there was damage to 2 properties with stones and thrown at windows. And the property where they're believed to have been evacuated from, the police say that the public damaged the door, and they believe perhaps would have attempted to gain entry. So, slightly toned down, but still incredibly serious and almost unprecedented in Norfolk and across the country, really.
Well, the police have said that the majority of people were protesting lawfully, but there was a significant minority that went too far. How do the people who've been targeting these houses know that they are actually housing asylum seekers?
This is the most interesting thing I keep getting asked, and to my knowledge, speaking to locals on the ground, there seems to be a sort of local database of HMOs that they believe the Home Office are using to house asylum seekers. They've been correct in some instances. For example, the first time where 5 men were moved out, and again last night and also on Wednesday when another group are believed to have been evacuated at some point after the violence erupted. So I think it's on social media and Facebook, and I've seen images myself it's literally just a picture of a house with an address, and they're being spread online, and there seems to be a really strong local knowledge of where these homes are.
And what are people around there in Thetford thinking of it all? Are they broadly supportive of the protests, or are they unhappy about it? And are they worried that people are shipping into the area to get involved?
I think it's actually been a very locally driven protest rather than other ones where we've seen where individuals are coming from all over. It's very locally driven, and it's split the town. The MP's come out and heavily condemned them. Him himself has been victims of harassment since the plans for RAF Barnham were announced, which would see 1,000 migrants moved into an RAF base on the edge of town. And so there's a lot of fear. As the police have said, a lot of people have been protesting legally because they're concerned about asylum seekers being moved into their town, both in HMOs and the potential plans for the base. So a lot of people are condemning the violence, but the truth is that there is a group among them who are continuing to rain violence upon these properties.
So, obviously they'll be hoping for a quieter night, and obviously the police have had a couple of their officers injured, but at the same time they've also been accused of maybe overreacting sometimes. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so Wednesday night marked, as I said, the most violent night so far, where there was a big clash between the police and the public. The police are understood to have used pepper spray against the protesters, and there's local claims that a woman in a mobility scooter was hit by pepper spray, which has, again, fueled sort of tensions and frustrations. So, but the police have defended their claims. They say they've acted appropriately and taken the measures that they've had to do. So, locals are getting frustrated, but the police are standing by the action they've taken. And to be truthful, they've faced serious violence against them, as we've seen with 2 officers being sent to hospital, who, by the way, were back on the front line on Thursday night, including the woman who was bitten. So, tension is building, violence is high, and no one really knows what's going to happen tonight, because as we've seen, these things are very organic and ad hoc, and they're completely sort of off the cuff things, so no one knows.
Henry, thanks very much for that. Just talking about what's been happening in Thetford and those protests outside asylum seeker homes, lots of violence, it seems, happening overnight. And we were talking to Professor of Social Psychology at St Andrews University, Stephen Reicher. Professor Reicher, I wondered, with what's happening in Thetford, we know that there have been other protests like this over the last couple of years across the UK and Northern Ireland. Do you think that basically these disputes about asylum accommodation essentially can become flashpoints for wider anger about immigration and social change?
Okay, well, thanks for coming back to me, Caroline. Let's hope the technology works this time.
Let's hope so.
So, I mean, in many ways, one obviously has to link this to a wider context, but I don't think that people respond spontaneously. I think what's going on is people have very real and very legitimate problems in their lives. If you look at Thetford, for instance, in the 1960s, it was one of the fastest growing small towns in the country. And then there was deindustrialization. Companies began to leave. Thermos left in about 2003. Now it's one of the most deprived places in the country. In fact, many of its estates are some of the most deprived in the whole country. And people want to understand that. They want to make sense of it. They want to do something about it. And then there are motivated political actors who come in and say it's all the fault of the asylum seekers, it's all the fault of these people. And so you've got to put together a background of people having real lived experience of problems and political activists who are trying to weaponize that and use it against particular groups.
But there might be people now listening to that in Thetford who say, well, look, I may feel that I've got a problem of deprivation or, the cost of living is getting to me, but it doesn't mean I lead to violence or necessarily blame immigrants for all my problems.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, one of the dangers here is, and I don't want to bite the hand that's feeding me, but that the media representations of these things are really significant. Because in your report, you talked about 100 people trying to force their way into houses. Well, yes, 100 people is 100 too many, but at the same time, you're talking about a town of 25,000 people, and therefore you're talking about one person in 250. The danger is that if all the media focus, if all the pictures you see, if all you hear about Thetford is that, it gives you a mistaken understanding of it being far more significant than it actually is. And that's important for the following reason. If you look at riots, we've studied many waves of riots over the years in 2011, 2024, those who riot often see themselves as, if you like, representing the silent majority. They see themselves as, if you like, champions of the community. So the more that they feel that they are in the majority, the more that they feel they represent the norm, the more empowered they will be to act. And we don't see those people sitting at home appalled by what's going on. We don't see, if you like, the great silent majority. And what was really interesting about the 2024 riots is they started off with a series of attacks on asylum seekers, and then people came out in counter-protests. And as soon as that happened, and the rioters could no longer say, well, we represent the community, it was clear they were in the minority, those riots stopped. They couldn't be seen to be community champions. And so I think it's really important that people come out and say, this isn't us, but equally, I think it's really important the media coverage points to those who aren't doing these spectacular things rather than just concentrate on the spectacular.
Professor of Social Psychology, Stephen Reicher, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.